3. The Hunter in the Dark. When one finds themselves in total blackness, they fall back on their other senses to fill in the gaps. During my capture and dragging to the prison, I had learned something, though I'm sure far from everything, of the keenness of ear and nose ascribed to the blind. But the causeway and what came after were different. There, for the most part, the blackness was also absolute. But my possession of a candle meant that I was never really immersed in the blind stupor of the underworld, and instead stared with half-focused eyes towards my one flickering lifeline in the dark, my motions all slow and calculated not to trouble its dancing flame, and my field of vision reaching perhaps 10 paces ahead or to either side before the shadow conquered all once more. Even so, this small bubble of vision was troubled by the bobbing of the flame and the shadows it cast, and more than once I scared myself senseless as the shadows of rubble or hanging stalactites made giant by the gleam rose up before me, only to vanish at the slight twitch of my wrist beneath the light. I walked until my already tired legs ached, and even at the end of what must have been 6 miles along the tunnel, I had not come to the route's end. I had passed several gaping intersections with other causeway tunnels of equal dimensions, but, fearful of getting lost and feeling no wind or other trace which might lead me to believe these intersecting passages led upward for the surface, I probed ever onward and took no turns. Occasionally, debris obstructed my path. Most of the time, these were stones from the ceiling. Especially in intersections, the roof seemed to have been left artfully natural, and the rock formations which had once decorated the lanes of the cave things had often fallen or been knocked loose over the intervening march of years. But sometimes these obstructions were remains, not unlike the ones I had found on the porch back in the lakeside village. Like those, these bones were often very visibly marred or injured, and weaponry, ranging from bone-hafted spears to hammers of some sort of copper or bronze, lay within reach. The dust and dry was more total here, and occasionally a desiccated piece of some shroud or cape was to be found amongst the dead, but these were obviously ancient, and their colors and designs were long lost to the ages. The smallest of these bone fields hosted perhaps a dozen individuals, and the largest several hundred, spread over about 1/4 of a mile of causeway. The gold lust of old Mexico clearly thrived among these dead things, for occasionally a great headdress or circlet of precious metal glinted forth like a tiny sun out of the gloom, and though at first I eagerly collected these as potential loot to be pawned on the surface, I quickly realized the weight would slow my passage, and naively vowed to recall the location for later visits. I did, however, swap my femurs for a sturdy copper hammer with a long haft of strange material I'd later come to learn was a chitinous leg segment from some great insect. Now and again my candle would flicker low and sputter out at the behest of some unfelt draft of air or unintended flinch on my part, and I would have to struggle with my ember-filled cap or my trusty flint in the murk to re-establish my vision. I became good at this, with time, and could usually get a flame back on the wick within a minute or two. But these minutes in blackness were long, and any noises I dredged up out of the distance as I struggled seemed doubly menacing in the dark. The noises themselves were many. Usually it was something as simple as stone cracking against stone, perhaps some rock or tile falling loose from the ceiling and clattering upon the cold ground down one of the connecting tunnels. But sometimes the noises were more bone-chilling. Shrieks, like those of a frenzied ape in a menagerie, cackling calls like those of fighting coyotes, or almost musical drones so distant they seemed almost ephemeral. Indeed, I sometimes convinced myself these were hallucinatory, certainly a good medicine for worry in all that unwholesome bleakness. And yet, sometimes they were so close they seemed impossible to deny. The slap of what sounded like bare feet upon stone reared up before or behind me now and then, a noise made all the more uncomfortable by the fact that large cracks in the cavern stone of the walls and great holes in the aged pathway left ample room for unseen watchers to hide. These sprinters in the dark, assuming that's what they were, would cross the causeway 40 or 50 yards off, and then fall still and silent, and not be heard again during my passing. I came out of the tunnel causeway into a much wider cavern a few hours into my trek, and at first, as with my fall into the lake chamber, I did not perceive there to be any light save my own. And yet there were light sources to be found, even more dull than the distant fungi on the lake bottom had been. They came from patches of lichen or moss that lined the roadsides now and then as they forked off and wound away from the clean exit to the tunnel I'd just exited, giving off a faint bluish gleam that was drowned by the stark candlelight, unless one looked hard enough. Based on what I would see later in my travels, I judge these crops of luminescent flora were tended as a sort of urban lighting system at one point, but had fallen into centuries of seedy neglect. I doused my candle, though I made sure to keep it handy, and allowed my eyes to adjust, standing still in the blackness as I squinted and struggled to see. The suggestion of edges and lines came forth from the haze of the netherworld's long night, and I saw that I was in another yawning space, something my ears had already discerned from the painfully obvious echoes my gentle footfalls sent rolling out through the void. But it was no empty cavern, nor was it host to some vast body of water. The chamber was slightly smaller than the lake chamber, and on many raised and lowered tiers carved into the stone, structures not unlike those of the fishing village leered out of the dark at me, their vacant windows and rounded door frames like deep black eyes set back in the shadows. Some were carved into the walls of the cavern itself, and others stood in tight ranks along the tiers of the settlement. Smooth roads, sized identically to the one I'd walked through the causeway tunnel, split this urban outpost into sectors, the moss in the ditches alongside them tossing muted glows up onto the ageless walls. Somewhere in the half-seen tangle of buildings, a stream gurgled as it lazily made its way down some channel that bisected the town. This place was as vacant as the fishing village on the lakeshore had been, and yet, like the village, I assumed there were likely many animal residents alive and well within its strange and masterfully carven walls. But I did not hear them, not readily, as had been the case in the lake chamber. Like so much of the causeway tunnel system, the scores of towering, angular buildings seemed stifled and withdrawn, giving me the impression it was even more unsafe to draw attention to oneself here than it had been in the lake chamber. Simultaneously, I could not help but feel like the city knew I had arrived, and did not want me there. I held my looted hammer close, and resolved not to use my candle so long as it wasn't absolutely necessary. I walked the half-lit roads, paying close heed to each and every shadow, moving slow and cautious, each footfall calculated to make as little noise as possible. Tiny things scurried past now and then, pattering like large roaches in the dark. But no giant shapes stirred, and no louder noises reached my ears. The echoes and hidden runners from the causeway tunnels still seemed absent here, and yet somehow that absence made me more uncomfortable. I suppose I'd grown used to the former horror, and the creeping silence of the large settlement whose streets I walked represented a newer and untested unknown. But much as I tried to count my blessings, and often as I turned corners or checked looming doorways to find the streets and chutes of the derelict city empty, I could not shake the feeling that I was not alone with the carrion scuttlers beneath my feet. I can only speak to what I glimpsed in the low, mossy glow from the roadside loam and mud-caked ditches, but the structures here were more grandiose than their counterparts on the lakeshore. Eerie, angular reliefs of tall, nude figures locked in scenes of struggle with great clawed monsters and many-legged beasts adorned the stone, and they had often been painted and outlined in vivid pigments that softly glimmered in the dark. But long neglect had stolen whatever light the luminescent paint once provided, and now only the hint of color was there to be seen. More than once I spent agonizing minutes straining my eyes at some distant shape along the wall of a glimpsed building, only to eventually discern it was a lifeless mural of a towering warrior or prowling hunter, given false life by my nerves and the tense atmosphere of the vague environment around me. There were great gardens set into walled verandas before many of the compounds here, all gone to seed, as with their counterparts back in the lake chamber. The layout of the structures reminded me of apartments in the densest sections of our own urban sprawls, and the more multi-entrance interconnected dwellings I passed, the more I inferred about the beings which had dwelt here. They must be intensely communal, I thought, and yet there was hierarchy, as among a colony of bees or ants, for one row of dwellings was far more opulent and richly carven than its fellows, and sat on a raised tier of the city near the roof, with its palatial compounds seeming to reach far back into the walls of the city's cavern. But even these aristocratic homes were often connected to the lesser dwellings by strange, fully enclosed hexagonal bridges that crisscrossed most of the streets, and wound their way between the upper stories of these otherworldly dormitories. The more I saw of them, the more I imagined the beings which had captured me scuttling through them in some remote earlier age. I shuddered to think that some twisted mockery of men had lived, and perhaps still lived, like ants down here in the dark, their wits and cunning and articulate hands bent to unknown and unknowable arts in perfect unison, in chambers that the sun's blessed light had never touched. Here my fascination with the great minds among the naturalists cursed me, for I began to wonder as I walked, whether the things had individual minds, or whether they operated under the chains of a sort of collective thought, and swarmed against their foes as wasps might a threat to their nests. What alien moral codes and lightless philosophies, if indeed such a term could be applicable, would such a colony of subterranean things have dreamt up? And yet, blind as I was to the nature of the tall men of the caverns then, I knew they must not be wholly unified, for the testaments to the war, or perhaps some societal forebear of the war, which ants had mentioned were all around me. The blackened husks of some flammable portion of the city, whose material of construction I could not then have guessed, was testament to a great act of arson and struggle, and I came to theorize the long-gone smoke from this great blaze was why the quartz clouds and other stony glory of the lake chamber's roof were not evident far above me. Swathes of the violently ended dead littered the tighter intersections of the settlement, often astride hastily erected barricades of sturdy stone furniture, and the debris of a city under siege. These defenders, for they all seemed to be in positions of reaction, like doorways and defensible alleys, were by now mounds of dusty bones and the rotted refuse of rags. These fields of the dead now hosted life all their own, with coiled centipedes the length of my forearm watching coldly as I passed from amongst the bones. Lonely, bloated ants whose rear ends blinked like those of lightning bugs, and whose cruel stingers glistened with venom in the half-light, marched in and out of the skulls that housed them. Fat rats with eyes too large for their skulls looked on from drains in the roadside, and fist-sized beetles grazed in the declining fungus or moss that filled the ditches. The gardens of the abandoned dormitory structures were bedecked with great curtains of webbing, in which the corpses of bats and flying insects hung still and silent. I did not see the spiders that raised them, but the webs were well beyond the height of a man, and in conjunction with the larger lurker I had spotted in the lake chamber, I had no desire to catch a glimpse of either, and steered well clear of the dwellings. I came then upon the stream at the city's center, and crossed it along a plain bridge connecting the roadways. Below me, herds of slow-moving, pig-sized creatures which looked remarkably like woodlice dipped in and out of the water, retreating into burrows and thickets of waist-high lichen in the mud that lined the waterway when I lingered too long. Dragonflies darted past now and then in the sector nearest the water, pale against the lightless deeps, and yet they made almost no discernible sound, a necessity, I suppose, for traversing the gloom undetected. In my meandering search for another exit to the chamber, I eventually came up onto the raised tier that hosted the most luxurious buildings. Here, the slaughter was more dense than it had been in other quarters, and it seemed every inch of ground had been fought for. Bones littered the road dense as cobbles in many places, and among the dead, great black bulks rose up like hillocks from the pale carpet of the slain. The massive desiccated carapaces of some great insects or crustaceans by the looks, skewered with many thrown spears of metal-tipped chitin. Perhaps beasts of war, loosed by the defenders during the final stand. This area was lit better than any other, and gradually I realized a great deal of the light was spilling out from the largest of the structures in the row, which boasted a great open face ringed by carved stony protrusions that gave the impression the entrance was a vast, yawning mouth. This grand entryway opened onto a sort of communal space, something I assumed immediately must be a church or temple of some kind. The broad chamber sat slightly lower than the street outside, and looking down into it, I saw that the floor was lined with shallow stony cups or depressions, which I assumed were meant to host squatting worshippers. Great mushrooms tall as small trees from the surface had been grown in big pots set into the walls, and their gills glowed a soft lavender, dousing the whole scene in an eerie, chromatic haze. At the far end, atop a great raised dais, had once been a terrible but elegantly crafted glass or crystal idol of some kind, but it had been toppled and rested in pieces upon the floor amidst a pool of dead skeletons bedecked in the gilded finery of clergy or shamans. The idol was huge and of segmented body. It seemed to have been reared up on some of its many legs, its several pairs of pincers raised high in exaltation above a head that seemed more a cluster of fragile antennae than a discernible skull. But as I say, this giant had been torn down, and now rested in ruin amidst the bones of its attendants. In its place, not carved but painted on the back wall in a coppery and chipped substance I was certain even at that distance was ancient blood, was a vast and even more vague shape of tendrils and feelers and teeth, like a devilfish, splayed with its tentacles wide along the stone canvas. This bloody painting had not ended there, for what I guessed to be text in a blocky, partly pictographic script had been crudely daubed over the etched texts of the prior temple, near black against the weird haze of the mushrooms that lit it. My spine straightened as I drank in the scene, and my hair stood on end. It was an eerie and unnerving spectacle, to be sure, but all of this city, and the underworld which housed it, were unnerving. There was something more, something wrong. As I stood still and scanned the room from the street, and drank in no movement even of beasts among the refuse of the civilization which had once worshipped there, I heard, faint as a dying breeze, the words of a deep and resonant voice ring out from a source unseen in the black halls and apertures at the rear of the chamber. I could not discern what it said, but I swear to this day the syllables and tone had the suggestion of English about them. The unseen eyes I had felt upon me throughout the city felt all the more present then, and my breath seemed to catch in my throat, as if even that was too loud for the gaping hush which followed. I did not linger, but I also did not run. Whether hallucinatory or not, I had the forethought to know I would only draw attention to myself by fleeing, and perhaps injure myself in the dark during my rush. Rather, I backed away until I had inched far enough along the street to be out of sight of the open-air temple chamber. Only then, when no following voice rang out in pursuit, and no other noise suggested movement in the temple, did I truly turn back to the task at hand and continue my search for an exit. My path took me down the other side of the raised tier, and eventually to what looked like a great gatehouse set into the side of the chamber. The doors which had once secured the city against the section of tunnel causeway beyond had been shattered, and their rubble gathered dust in the shadow of the tunnel mouth. A bridge over a bend in the cavern's stream formed a sort of second line of defense, and that bridge was strewn with yet more bony ruin. Staring out into the tunnel beyond, just as dark as the first, I had time to realize I was likely in for another very long walk, and given I had bumped into no water in the first section of the causeway, I decided I needed to descend to the stream and drink well enough to last me some time. I approached the bridge and looked down into the gully that hosted the stream. The lichen scrub was less dense here, and I felt fortunate, for the giant woodlice were nowhere to be seen, and the stream ran clear and noisy here, free of stagnant pools or repellent breeding grounds for flying insects. I left the embers in the mushroom cap I carried and my hammer beside the jacket along the road to free my hands, and picked a cautious way down along the muddy bank. And before long, I had sunk those hands into the lukewarm water, my thirst finally catching up with me after so long spent wandering. I was lost in the simple comfort of the moment, and did not notice motion off to my side in the shadows beneath the bridge until I rose to leave. I looked over, my peripheral vision having picked up some trace or flicker in the murk. But at first I saw nothing to warrant my glance. The creek gurgled out of the dark into the soft moss light of the other side without being broken, and no shape stood in the shadows along the ground. But then I discerned that which I had taken to be rocks in the current were the hollow, slightly translucent shells of some of the giant woodlice, scattered like dishes after a feast. After that, as my heart struggled to keep pace, my eyes caught another flicker, directly this time, as a strand or string hanging from above seemed to dance and twitch outward from the underside of the bridge, in my direction. I looked up. Immediately, I recognized that it was no strand of vine, no hanging fungal tendril. There were two long and tapering things dancing in the darkness, moving with a life of their own in a world which had never known wind, and glistening with the dull sheen of an insect's skin. Antennae or feelers of some kind, thrown down from some hiding something in the black pool of sightless obfuscation on the bottom of the bridge. Long and delicate, They were almost twice my height. Yet, whatever was using them to test the air was absolutely still, and made not a sound to contest the low gurgle of the creek beneath it. Again they twitched, and this time I backed slowly away, just as I had done at the temple. I went up the incline on my rear, my hands caked with the silty mud of the shore, my eyes ever on the feelers where they waved in the open air beneath the bridge. I crested the top and wound back to the road, but always kept my back to the exit gate. No movement or sound issued from beneath the bridge, at least not that I heard over the low murmur of running water. I stooped, back still towards the dark of the causeway, and retrieved the improvised jacket-turned pack, keeping my scavenged hammer close. I dipped a hand down into the jumble and produced the candle I had used in the earlier tunnel. I lit it, each motion or forced look downward at my work matched by an equal glance at the bridge, where still no motion betrayed I had been noticed. The embers of the slow-burning gills in the mushroom cap were low, then, but I managed to get the wick going after a series of sputtering, nervous breaths to fuel the heat. Another glance at the bridge, and another jolt of relief as nothing met my eyes. I stood, planting the candle once more in the mushroom cap to form a perch with which to hold the candle. Another look to the bridge, and another sigh of relief. I bound the arms of the bundled jacket about my neck, so that it would hang against my back. Another look to the bridge, and yet another flood of soothed nerves. Finally, I crouched and took up the hammer, each move and each process undertaken with all the noiseless caution I could muster. Another look to the bridge, but this time there was no soothing relief. There was no silent sigh as I counted myself safe. There was only quiet, barely contained panic. I had looked away to find the hammer's haft for perhaps a count of 2, and yet the thing beneath the bridge had needed no more time than that, and it had moved in absolute silence. The thing was perched along the stone rail of its hideaway, stone still. It was more bleak than midnight, and glistened in the dull glow of the cavern, my small and insignificant flame dancing in the reflections along its inky carapace at that distance. It was spiny and angular, with long rear legs that seemed poised for motion. 8 feet long through the body, perhaps, with lengthy limbs and feelers that made it seem far larger. It was sleek and built for motion, I could tell. Even through the dark, it gave all the impressions of a graceful, cold, predatory poise. And yet, other than that it seemed vaguely like a massive cricket, I could determine no details further than what I have listed in that moment, for the cavern was, as ever, bleak, and my candle served more to blind me than to cast light upon it. What I could see was that its huge eyes, black as its body, were cast my way, my candle a pinprick of white amidst their seas of murky gloom. I stood there, waiting for it to move for a long while, my fist clenched on the haft of the hammer I held, trying to steel myself for a fight I had no doubts I would lose. Running was no option either, for it had crested the bridge in a wink, and I could see by the silhouette of its body that it might well be able to cover the 40 or 50 yards between us in a single bound of its powerful legs. But it never did move. It just watched on, statuesque and terrible, even its antennae frozen in place. I stepped back, slow and methodical, and still it did not budge. I repeated the motion, cautious as ever I've been before or since, until my heels thumped against the rubble of the shattered causeway gate. Even then, I did not look away. I merely stumbled and probed, backwards footfall by backwards footfall, until I'd crested the stones and jagged bones, and leveled out on the pockmarked roadway beyond. Each motion brought the fear that the thing would follow, but it did not pursue. I backed into the tunnel, too focused on the immediate threat to worry about the dark or the noises I had heard during my crossing of the first causeway. I merely kept my eyes towards the faint glow of the city cavern and the ebon shape that lurked there until distance made it a pinprick, and the moss light grew all but imperceptible against the gleam of the candle I held. Even when I could no longer see the creature, I kept the candle held aloft in its direction, sliding cautious and careful backwards all the while. I bumped some corpse or fallen masonry along the route now and then, but the way was mostly clear, and I never allowed myself to get so invested in progress that I lost track of the void that closed in around me as I backed down the tunnel. A mile and more I walked, and no sound or motion teased the tunnel as I moved. But the silence that haunted the city chamber still reigned here, and I still felt as if hostile and cunning eyes were upon me. I would guess an hour passed that way, and more miles of the tunnel fell away in my wake, but such guesses are cheap in a world with no sunrise or sunset, especially when nerves are frayed. But it ended when, after a longer stint than most, my candle flickered out, whether by my own mistake of twitchy motion or whether by pure chance, and left me stalled in the dark. I had become practiced with this in the earlier tunnels, and brought the wick to the barely perceptible embers once more, praying that it would catch quickly. On the second try, it did. There was a soft scratching as two long and tapering feelers skittered back into the dark beyond the flame, and I rose to see the familiar pinpricks of light reflected back at me in staring eyes amidst the shadow. How much ground it had covered in the darkness, how close it had trailed me during my retreat, I could not know. But I now knew I would not so easily escape it, and though it still seemed hesitant to take me head-on or approach the stark light of the tiny flame, I realized my candle was growing short indeed, and that at some point soon I would need to replace it. This changed the way I thought about my predicament, and I began to pay closer attention to my surroundings as I continued my slow backpedal, and the familiar eyes of my unwanted companion faded away. I paid closer heed to the occasional debris along the floor and the occasional breaks in the masonry along the walls, counting each agonizing second on the move without discovering any useful tool, my candle struggling all the while. At last, after another period of exhausting retreat, I spotted a ragged alcove just before a broad intersection in the causeway, a split in the otherwise smooth tunnel's side, with black shadow beyond. I leaned in just long enough to determine there was space within. It was a barren cavity in the stone, perhaps 7 feet deep and a couple wide, with a low and cramped entrance, perhaps expanded by the things which roamed the tunnels over the years the route had been in decline and disuse. I had seen similar places before, always counting them as potential hiding spots for the barefoot runners I heard, and giving them a wide berth. Now, finding one empty, I put the vague and desperate plan I had cooked up into action. I withdrew to the far wall across from the aperture, and carefully set my candle and its bed of coals upon the floor there. I then made for the hole, crouched low, and scuttled swiftly inside, hammer in hand. I swung the makeshift pack from my back and left it wedged in the tiny entrance, blocking most of the faint and sputtering candlelight from across the causeway. Then I stood as straight as I could, as far back as I could, having to bend at the neck to accommodate the unforgiving stone of the ceiling. I breathed low and quiet, and moved as little as possible, biding my time. There was part of me that hoped the stalker would find the empty hall and go on its way, finding easier prey to sate itself upon. But I knew even in that ragged state that such thoughts were foolishness, and that it would push through my flimsy barrier and try to get in at me. But the hole was too small to allow it easy passage, and I anticipated what was to come. Even so, the wait was agonizingly long, and the beast did not act until the fading light from my dying candle had gone completely cold. Minutes passed in the black, still and silent. Then stirring at the aperture beneath me, a thin strand of unseen feeler inserted through the gap in the shoddy barricade, brushing my face and limbs as the hunter delicately and mutely probed the space within. It tasted the sweat and fear of me in there, as I had known deep down it would. There was a scuffling in the blind black as something shoved the pack from the entrance, and began thumping its carapace against the ragged doorway. What happened next I obviously cannot describe visually. The absolute shadow of the deepest reaches of the earth saw to that. But I had planned for the moment, and now that the thing had finally come, I was ready. Unable to hold the hammer overhand in the tight quarters, I held my looted weapon like a pendulum out before me, with the head downward, and brought it crashing down for the ground when I heard the noise of the thing pressing in. It was too large to fit inside, but was clearly desperate enough for a meal to probe with its head, mandibles snapping audibly in the murk as it strained for limbs and flesh it could not quite reach. I struck it as if driving a fence post or churning butter into the ground, and I struck it for a long, long time. Sometimes the hammer's head met stone and clanged like a sonorous bell, but most of my strikes in that cubby of shorn rock crackled against spiny exoskeleton and shattered chitin. I struck again and again, long enough that my shoulders ached for days afterward. Though I did not perceive it, I must have screamed like the enraged apes naturalists describe as I did it, for I struggled to hear for a long while, and my throat was ragged for a week. When, in time, I tapered off into an exhausted huff and began to finally catch my breath, I heard no motion from below me. The fluttering feelers, which had danced like feeble fingers across my face early in the struggle as the beast beneath thrashed and kicked in vain, had fallen still. The ground of the space was slick with sticky ichor, and when I pressed blind against the mass blocking the entrance with the hammer, a great heave sent the sound of bony plates grinding on cold stone echoing down the empty halls. I found the dislodged pack, fished around within, and eventually put hands on my flint. I ducked out of the aperture, nearly tripped on the broken form of the unseen hunter, and then spent breathless minutes slumped against the far wall near where I thought I'd left the candle, not quite believing that I was still alive. When time set me loose from my panic, I probed around until I found the mushroom cap, which had gone entirely cold. I caught the sparks from my striker with it, counted yet another string of blessings as I roused some small simmer among the singed gills, and lit my second candle, a process that took probably half an hour, despite the simplicity I give it in words here. No noises troubled me in the tunnels during that time, and perhaps because of the scope of the victory I had just won, I did not think of them just then. The light revealed the broken hunter was indeed cricket-like. Its head was pulped and the chitin of it was in shards, so I could not say exactly what its jaws or eyes had looked like up close. But the corpse was longer than my body, even with the head pounded off, and, testament to the desperate and animal state of mind my environment had placed me in, the thick and spiny rear legs immediately struck me as a potential food source. With some effort, I twisted both off and cut away the thicker uppermost portions with the obsidian knife I had taken, leaving me with 2 3-foot segments of armor-encrusted meat to carry forward with me on the journey. But I had no stomach for more travel just then. I sat down in the low candlelight, exhausted to my bones, and ate one of the few cooked lobster crawlers I had carried out from the lake chamber with me, tasting almost nothing, food having already become a weary necessity rather than a joyous reprieve. I crawled back into the stained alcove, replaced my flimsy jacket pack barricade, and doused my light before slumbering heavy for a long while.